June 9th, 2022, a sunny Thursday afternoon in Alton, Illinois. 22-year-old Liese Dodd should have been putting finishing touches on her nursery, maybe folding tiny baby clothes or arranging stuffed animals. She was 8 months pregnant, just weeks away from meeting her daughter. The due date was circled on her calendar. Friends had been asking about baby shower plans. Her mother had been calling regularly to check in, as mothers do when their daughters are about to give birth. Instead, that same mother was now driving to her daughter's apartment on Bolivar Street, worry growing with each unanswered phone call. For several days, Liese had gone completely silent. No texts back, no calls returned, no social media activity, nothing. This wasn't like Liese at all, especially not when she was so close to her due date. When her mother arrived at the apartment complex around 1 p.m. and made her way inside using her spare key, she discovered a scene that would haunt her forever. Her daughter had been brutally murdered and decapitated. The apartment that should have been filled with baby preparations was instead a crime scene. Liese's head was later found discarded in a dumpster nearby, thrown away like garbage. Before we dive deeper into this case, let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight, because this story needs to be heard everywhere, because this nightmare didn't begin on June 9th. It started with a relationship that had been falling apart for months, maybe even years. This is Accused, where we dig deep into the cases that demand justice. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button because we cover the cases that demand answers. And this case demanded answers from day one. The murder of Liese Dodd and her unborn daughter sent shockwaves through Illinois and made national headlines, but not for the reasons you might think. This wasn't just another domestic violence case. This wasn't just another tragic story. The level of brutality was so extreme that it left even experienced homicide investigators struggling to understand what they were seeing. But there's more to this story than what made the news. We're going to walk through the relationship timeline that police uncovered, the evidence that painted a picture of an on and off romance gone deadly wrong, the psychological evaluation that delayed justice for nearly 2 years, and the legal proceedings that took nearly 3 years to reach a conclusion. This is the story of how a turbulent relationship became an act of violence so brutal it defies understanding, and how a mother's worst nightmare became a community's wake-up call about the dangers that pregnant women face. Liese Dodd was 22 years old and nearly 8 months pregnant when she was killed on June 9th, 2022. She lived alone in her apartment on the 3,400 block of Bolivar Street in Alton, Illinois, a quiet area where neighbors knew each other and looked out for one another. She had an on and off relationship with Deundrea Holloway, but the baby she was carrying wasn't his. This detail would become crucial to understanding the motive behind what happened next. Those who knew Liese described her as someone who was genuinely excited about becoming a mother. She had been preparing for this baby for months, setting up a nursery, buying clothes, and talking about her future plans as a single mom. She had recently moved to the Bolivar Street apartment, trying to build a stable life for herself and her soon-to-be-born daughter. Her neighbor April Wooten later told reporters that Liese had recently moved to the area and seemed like a nice, quiet person who kept to herself but was always polite when they crossed paths in the hallway. The apartment complex was the kind of place where people minded their own business but still cared about their neighbors. Deundrea Holloway was 25 years old and had been in this complicated relationship with Liese for some time. The relationship was described by prosecutors and court documents as on and off, which meant periods of breaking up, followed by getting back together, then breaking up again. Anyone who's been in one of these relationships knows how emotionally exhausting they can be. This pattern of breaking up and reconciling can create a lot of emotional stress, jealousy, and feelings of abandonment or rejection. It can also create a sense of ownership or control that becomes dangerous when one person tries to move on permanently. The fact that Liese was carrying another man's baby while still connected to Holloway would become a crucial detail in understanding what drove him to such extreme violence. We don't know exactly when Liese became pregnant or how Holloway reacted to the news that he wasn't the father, but court records make it clear that this was a source of tension. Pregnancy can be a particularly dangerous time for women in abusive relationships. Statistics show that domestic violence often escalates during pregnancy, and the risk of homicide actually increases when a woman is pregnant. The reasons are complex, but they often involve jealousy, control, and the abuser's fear of losing power over their victim. The details of their relationship troubles aren't fully public because many domestic violence incidents go unreported or undocumented until it's too late. But what we do know from court records is that this wasn't a stable, healthy partnership. On and off relationships can be particularly dangerous when they involve jealousy, control issues, or feelings of abandonment. According to reports and court documents, Dodd and Holloway had this on and off relationship pattern, and Dodd was 8 months pregnant at the time of her murder, though the child was not Holloway's. The pregnancy timeline suggests that Liese had moved on from Holloway romantically and was preparing to raise her child as a single mother. This kind of situation can trigger rage in controlling partners who can't accept that their ex has built a life without them. In the days leading up to June 9th, something changed dramatically. Liese, who normally stayed in regular contact with her family, especially her mother, suddenly went completely quiet. Her phone calls stopped. Her text messages stopped. Her social media went silent. For a mother whose daughter is 8 months pregnant and due to give birth any day, this silence would have been absolutely terrifying. We can only imagine the thoughts going through her mother's mind as hours turned into days, without any word from Liese. First, maybe she thought Liese was just busy or tired from the pregnancy. But as the hours stretched into a full day, then 2 days, then 3 days, the worry would have grown into panic. She probably called hospitals, thinking maybe Liese had gone into labor early. She might have called friends, asking if anyone had heard from her daughter. She probably drove by the apartment complex, looking for signs of life, maybe hoping to see Liese's car or lights on in her windows. When you can't reach someone you love, your mind goes to all the worst-case scenarios. But even in her worst nightmares, Liese's mother probably never imagined what she would actually find. Dodd's body was found on June 9, 2022, when her mother, who had not heard from her in several days, went to her home to check on her. The mother's growing panic is something any parent can understand. When you can't reach your child, especially one who's about to give birth, every hour feels like forever. She tried calling multiple times a day. She tried texting, asking simple questions like, "Are you okay?" or "Just let me know you're alive." Nothing. Finally, she couldn't wait anymore and drove to Liese's apartment on the 3400 block of Bolivar Street in Alton. She probably knocked first, calling out her daughter's name. When there was no answer, she used her spare key to get inside. At about 1 p.m., officers responded to the 3400 block of Bolivar Street in Alton, Illinois, after Liese's mother called 911 in complete shock and horror. What Liese's mother found inside that apartment was beyond anyone's worst nightmare. Her daughter had been murdered in the most brutal way possible. The scene was so horrific that it would become one of the most shocking crimes in Illinois that year, and it would haunt everyone who responded to that call. Neighbor April Wooten recalled June 9th, when Dodd was found. All of this was filled with cops. They let us know someone was found dead next door. Her mom looked so broken. She looked so broken. The image of a mother discovering her pregnant daughter's murdered body is something that stays with everyone who heard about this case. Wooten's description of the mother looking so broken captures the complete devastation that no parent should ever have to experience. The apartment complex, which had been quiet and peaceful that morning, was suddenly swarmed with police cars, ambulances, and crime scene investigators. Neighbors came out of their apartments, trying to understand what was happening. The yellow crime scene tape went up, and suddenly everyone realized that something terrible had occurred right next door to where they lived. Question for you. If you hadn't heard from a family member who was 8 months pregnant for several days, would you A, keep calling and texting hoping they'd respond, B, drive straight to their house to check on them, C, call the police to do a welfare check, or D, contact other family members first to see if anyone had heard from them? This is a real situation that many families face, and there's no perfect answer. But Lisa's mother's decision to go check on her daughter personally led to the discovery that started the investigation. Let me know what you'd do in the comments, because understanding how families handle these situations can help us all be better prepared to help each other. The Alton Police Department responded immediately to the scene with everything they had. What they found was a crime so brutal that it shocked even experienced investigators who had seen decades of violence. Then, Alton Police Chief Marcus Polito, now the Chief Deputy for the Madison County Sheriff's Department, said in a video released at the time that this was one of the most horrific crimes the department had ever investigated. And this is coming from law enforcement officers who have worked homicide cases, gang violence, and drug-related murders. When police say a case is the worst they've ever seen, you know you're dealing with something truly horrific. The crime scene told a clear story of extreme violence and rage. Lisa had been decapitated, meaning her head had been completely severed from her body. Her head was later found discarded in a dumpster near the apartment complex, thrown away like garbage. The level of violence suggested this wasn't a random crime, a robbery gone wrong, or even a typical domestic violence incident where someone loses their temper and hits too hard. This was something much more personal, much more rage-filled, and much more calculated. The fact that the killer took the time to dismember the body and dispose of the head separately shows a level of planning and brutality that goes beyond a crime of passion. Investigators immediately began processing the scene for evidence, and they had a lot to work with. They collected DNA samples from the apartment, looking for any biological evidence that didn't belong to Lisa. They dusted for fingerprints on door handles, windows, and any surfaces that the killer might have touched. They photographed everything, documenting the position of the body, any signs of struggle, and the overall condition of the apartment. They also began canvassing the neighborhood, talking to anyone who might have seen or heard something unusual in the days leading up to the discovery. In cases like this, the first 48 hours are crucial because evidence can disappear, crime scenes can be contaminated, and witnesses' memories can fade or become less reliable. But the police had several advantages in this case. They had a clear crime scene, they had a victim whose life and relationships they could investigate thoroughly, and they had a strong lead almost immediately. The investigation quickly focused on Deundrea Holloway because of his documented relationship with Lisa. While the baby wasn't his, their on-and-off relationship meant he was someone who had regular contact with her, knew her daily routines, knew where she lived, and probably had keys or easy access to her apartment. Police began building a comprehensive case against Holloway, gathering evidence that would eventually lead to multiple serious charges. They interviewed friends and family members about the relationship history, collected phone records to see when Holloway and Lisa had last been in contact, and looked into any previous incidents of domestic violence or police calls to the apartment. They also began forensic analysis of any physical evidence found at the scene. Madison County State's Attorney Tom Hain announced that the evidence against Holloway was strong enough to file multiple serious charges: first-degree murder, intentional homicide of an unborn child, dismemberment, concealment of a homicidal death, and motor vehicle violations. The multiple charges reflected not just the severity of the crime, but also the fact that Illinois law recognizes the killing of an unborn child as a separate offense. This meant that Holloway was facing charges for 2 deaths, not just 1. The dismemberment and concealment charges showed that prosecutors believed the killing was followed by deliberate attempts to hide evidence and dispose of the body. The motor vehicle charges suggested that Holloway used a car during the commission of the crime, possibly to transport Lisa's head to the dumpster where it was found. Each of these charges carried significant prison time, and together they painted a picture of a crime that was both brutal and calculated. But here's where the case took an unexpected turn that would delay justice for nearly 2 years. After Holloway was arrested and charged, his defense attorneys requested a psychological evaluation. Mental health evaluations in murder cases are serious legal matters because they determine whether a defendant is mentally fit to stand trial and understand the charges against them. The court granted this request, and Holloway was examined by mental health professionals who specialize in forensic psychology. These evaluations can take weeks or months to complete because they involve extensive testing, interviews, and analysis of the defendant's mental state, medical history, and ability to understand legal proceedings. The evaluation found that Holloway was not mentally fit to stand trial at that time. This meant he couldn't proceed with the legal process until he received psychological treatment and was deemed competent to understand what was happening in court. This finding was devastating for Liese's family, who had been waiting for justice and closure. Mental health issues don't excuse murder, but the legal system requires that defendants be mentally competent to stand trial. This means they have to understand what they're charged with, understand the potential consequences, and be able to work with their attorneys to mount a defense. If a defendant isn't competent, they can't have a fair trial, and any conviction could be overturned on appeal. So instead of going straight to trial, Holloway was placed in a state psychological care facility where he would receive treatment until doctors determined he was fit to stand trial. This was frustrating for everyone involved, but it was legally necessary. The legal process moved incredibly slowly from this point. Holloway spent months in psychological care while Liese's family waited for any kind of progress in the case. Mental health treatment in the legal system can take a very long time because doctors need to stabilize a person's condition, try different medications, and conduct ongoing evaluations to determine if the person is improving. There are also legal requirements about how long someone can be held for treatment and what happens if they never become competent to stand trial. During this time, the case largely disappeared from public attention, but Liese's family was living with the uncertainty every single day. They didn't know if Holloway would ever be deemed fit for trial. They didn't know if there would ever be justice for their daughter and granddaughter. They were stuck in a legal limbo that added another layer of trauma to their already overwhelming grief. By early 2023, nearly a year after the murder, Holloway was finally declared mentally fit to stand trial. The treatment had apparently been successful, and mental health professionals determined that he could understand the charges against him and participate in his own defense. He was returned to the Madison County Jail to face the charges that had been waiting for him. The case could finally move forward, but even then, legal proceedings continued to drag on. There were pre-trial motions where defense attorneys tried to suppress evidence or challenge the charges. There were evidence hearings where prosecutors had to present their case to the judge to make sure they had enough evidence to go to trial. There were scheduling conflicts, attorney changes, and all the other procedural delays that are unfortunately common in complex criminal cases. For the family, each delay meant more waiting, more uncertainty, and more time living with the knowledge that their daughter's killer was still not held accountable. The case continued through 2023 and into 2024, with various hearings and motions, but no trial date was set. This is actually common in murder cases, especially ones involving mental health issues. But it doesn't make it any easier for families to endure. They have to relive the trauma over and over again with each court appearance, never knowing if this will be the hearing that finally moves things forward or just another delay. The media attention that initially surrounded the case began to fade as other stories took its place. But for Liese's family, this case was their entire world. They couldn't move on or find closure while the legal proceedings dragged on year after year. Finally, in December 2024, nearly 2.5 years after Liese's murder, there was a major breakthrough that no one saw coming. Holloway pled guilty to charges of first-degree murder and intentional homicide of Dodd's unborn child in December 2024. This guilty plea was significant for several reasons. First, it meant there would be no trial. Holloway was admitting to killing both Liese and her unborn child. Second, it meant the family wouldn't have to sit through weeks or months of a trial where all the horrible details would be discussed repeatedly in court. Trials can be incredibly traumatic for families because they have to hear all the evidence, see crime scene photos, and listen to testimony about their loved one's final moments. Third, a guilty plea usually indicates that the defendant and their attorneys knew the evidence against them was overwhelming and that a trial would likely result in a conviction anyway. The plea probably came as a huge relief to Liese's family because it meant they could finally have some certainty. There would be no appeals of a jury verdict, no questions about whether the right person was convicted, and no trial that could potentially go wrong. Holloway had admitted his guilt, and now the only question was what his punishment would be. The case could move straight to sentencing, where the family would finally have their chance to speak directly to the man who had destroyed their lives and tell him how his actions had affected them. This victim impact statement would be their opportunity to make sure Holloway understood the full consequences of what he had done. On Friday, January 17, 2025, he was sentenced to 60 years in prison. The sentencing hearing on January 17, 2025, was the moment Liese's family had been waiting for since June 9, 2022. After nearly 3 years of legal proceedings, psychological evaluations, delays, and uncertainty, they were finally going to see justice served. Deundrea S. Holloway was sentenced to 60 years in prison for the murder of Liese Dodd and her unborn child. The sentence was structured very specifically: 30 years for Liese's murder and 30 years for the death of her unborn child, to be served consecutively, not concurrently. This means Holloway will have to serve both sentences completely, one after the other, not at the same time. In practical terms, this means he would have to serve 60 years before being eligible for parole. The Illinois Supreme Court had previously determined that an unborn child cannot be construed as a second murder victim for purposes of seeking a sentence of life in prison, which meant prosecutors couldn't seek a life sentence based on the two deaths. But the 60-year sentence was specifically designed to ensure that Holloway would likely spend the rest of his life behind bars. Madison County State's Attorney Tom Hain said he remains confident the 60-year sentence will result in Holloway remaining behind bars for the rest of his life. "I don't believe he'll be seeing the light of day as a free man," said Hain. Given that Holloway was 25 years old at the time of the crime and is now 27 or 28, a 60-year sentence would make him 87 or 88 years old before he could even be considered for parole. In reality, most people don't live to see freedom after sentences of this length. The most powerful and heartbreaking moment of the sentencing came when Liese's mother delivered her victim impact statement. The mother of decapitated, pregnant murder victim Liese Dodd told her daughter's killer in court on Friday that the victim's family had also received a life sentence as a result of his actions. Her words were carefully chosen and devastatingly accurate. She explained that on the night Liese was murdered, her entire family received their own life sentence. A sentence of living without Liese, a sentence of never meeting the granddaughter they would never hold, a sentence of birthdays and holidays forever marked by absence. Her statement captured not just her own grief, but the ripple effects of violence that go far beyond the immediate victims. She spoke about losing not just her daughter, but also the granddaughter she would never meet. She talked about the future that was stolen from all of them, the birthdays that would never be celebrated, the holidays that would forever be marked by emptiness, the graduations and weddings and everyday moments that would never happen. She described the pain of walking past the nursery that Liese had been preparing, seeing tiny clothes that would never be worn and toys that would never be played with. She talked about how the family would never get to hear their granddaughter's first word, see her first steps, or watch her grow up. The mother's statement reminded everyone in that courtroom that murder doesn't just take one life or even two lives. It destroys entire families, entire communities, and entire futures that will never exist. The sentencing judge listened to every word of the mother's statement and acknowledged the devastating impact this crime had on the family and the community. The judge noted the extreme brutality of the crime and the fact that it involved not just one victim, but two, Liese and her unborn child. The judge also acknowledged the family's long wait for justice and expressed hope that the sentence would provide some measure of closure, even though nothing could bring back what was lost. The courtroom was filled with family members, friends, law enforcement officers, and community members who had been following this case for nearly 3 years. Many were in tears as they listened to the mother's statement and witnessed this final chapter in a case that had shocked everyone who heard about it. Today, almost 3 years after Liese Dodd was murdered, her case stands as one of the most brutal examples of how dangerous domestic violence can become, especially during pregnancy. Statistics show that homicide is a leading cause of death for pregnant women in the United States, and most of those homicides are committed by intimate partners. 2 precious lives were lost on June 9, 2022. A young woman who was excited about becoming a mother, and her unborn daughter who never got the chance to take her first breath, never got to feel her mother's arms around her, never got to experience any of the joy and love that was waiting for her. The violence was so extreme, so brutal, that it shocked even experienced law enforcement officers who had seen decades of criminal cases. The level of rage and hatred required to decapitate someone and then dispose of their head like garbage is something that most people can't even imagine. For what? What could possibly justify such an act of violence against a pregnant woman and her child? What could drive someone to such extreme brutality against 2 innocent people? These are the questions that haunt cases like this. There's no answer that makes sense. No explanation that could ever justify what happened to Liese and her baby. Some crimes are so senseless, so evil, that they force us to confront the darkest possibilities of human nature. This case reminds us that domestic violence can escalate beyond anything we think is possible, and that pregnancy, which should be a time of joy and protection, can actually be a time of increased danger for women in abusive relationships. The case also highlights the importance of staying connected with our loved ones and taking action when something doesn't feel right. Liese's mother's decision to check on her daughter when she went quiet probably led to a faster discovery of the crime and a quicker arrest of the perpetrator. If she had waited longer or assumed Liese was just busy, critical evidence might have been lost, and the case might have been much harder to solve. Her maternal instincts and her willingness to act on her concerns probably made the difference between this case being solved quickly and it becoming a cold case that dragged on for years. Liese Dodd and her unborn daughter deserved so much more than the violence that ended their lives. They deserved love, safety, and the chance to build a life together. Liese deserved to hold her daughter, to watch her grow up, to experience all the joys of motherhood she was looking forward to. Her daughter deserved to be born, to take her first breath, to feel her mother's love, and to live the life that was stolen from her before she ever had a chance. Instead, they became another tragic reminder that domestic violence can escalate to the unthinkable in the blink of an eye, and that the people we should be able to trust the most can sometimes become the greatest threat to our safety and our lives.